Okay, Hilary, we are having a great conference here on new realism. Some people, including your friend Umberto Eco, have said, oh yes, realism is back, but why new? What's new in this realism? And but you are a clear example of, someone who was a realist some years ago, perhaps became an anti-realist, but then is realist in a new sense. There are many differences between the realism you endorse now and the realism you endorsed until 76, I think. So the first question, given this kind of conference, is, could you stress what the differences between your old new realism and the new one to answer Umberto Eco's?
Well, I don't want, my immediate reaction is to say, don't overstress the differences. For example, the wonderful, I'm very grateful for this wonderful introduction that was by a historian of philosophy, a field dear to my heart, even though I can't remember dates. I mean, the reason I couldn't become a historian is I can never remember dates, but ideas I can remember, and history of ideas has been a passion of mine for many years. And I would say the dichotomy, however, I would not make a dichotomy between abstract philosophy and philosophy which aims at guiding our lives. I think Plato would have detested such a dichotomy. And for me, in many ways, Plato has long been a model, not because I'm a Platonist, or I could say Aristotle as well, because in fact I've read much more Aristotle. As far as reading in Greek is concerned, I've read a lot of Aristotle in Greek, and I've read very little Plato in the actual Greek. But both of them felt that you cannot draw such a dichotomy between theory and practice. Of course, practice rightly said that that they didn't fully engage this sphere of practice, but certainly they tried. Plato, remember, was deeply involved in the crises of the Athenian democracy. And I do not read him as Stone did, as an anti-democrat. I think, in fact, it is interesting that the person who was for the tyranny was Thrasymachus, who was really caricatured, attacked by Plato. And many of Plato's own students are dissuaded by Plato from attacking the democracy. So I would say, we need abstract. Philosophy has many faces, but above all, philosophy has to both be concerned with purely intellectual issues, and Plato, we know, was from the late Gregory Pastos, was fascinated by this new science of mathematics, or this emerging great science of Greek mathematics. And there's a story which last Ted endorsed, that Plato took 10 years off from philosophy to do mathematics. I say, first of all, let us not see this as a dichotomy. Either we try to get the right theory, or we try to get a good guide to life. The test is not that every piece of philosophy one does should have practical bearing, but that the philosopher needs to be engaged both with what I might call inspiration. Philosophy should, at times at least, be inspiring, but also be concerned with solid reason, with solid theoretical underpinnings. So in that respect, I would begin by saying, in that respect, I don't see a difference between realism and new and old. It's just that this kind of realism that's concerned, that rejects all theory practice dichotomies, has to be brought back from time to time. Again and again, philosophy tends to drift away from the recognition that it has to do both. That was, by the way, the theme of Etienne Gilson's great set of lectures at Harvard, at the Unity of Philosophical Experience. That philosophy makes the same mistake over and over again. Like, I was shocked when I read Gilson's Gifford lectures, Harvard lectures, William James lectures were given long before when I was 6 years old, so naturally I didn't hear them. But when I read them years later and discovered the great mistake of medieval philosophy was that it tended looking for some other science to solve the problems of philosophy. I was shocked. Written about the Middle Ages. So first of all, let us say that I use the word realism deliberately, and I do not want to say this is just a whole different thing, wholly new thing. Let's not, it's not a great compliment to an idea to say, oh, this is a 21st century idea. I remember at the beginning of the 20th century, G.K. Chesterton mocked people who thought it was really a compliment to say, this is a 20th century idea. And let's not repeat that mistake. Now, with that said, I am willing to talk about what's new in my realism, but I want to begin by saying what is continuous with the tradition is what I just said.
Hilary, certainly one continuity in your philosophy is realism about the existence of theoretical entities in science. Perhaps people didn't get it when they thought you were anti-realist about this issue also. So could you say a little more about this and perhaps your no miracles argument that support this?
First of all, it may clarify things if, for me, Michael Dummett and I miss him terribly, and I was thunderstruck at his recent death. But for me, Michael Dummett's William James lectures at Harvard were really responsible for the major changes. I think many of those changes I now think were a mistake, and I think internal realism was a mistake. Nevertheless, it made me aware that, and it took me a long time to assimilate that realism about entities, called realism and anti-realism about entities, realism and anti-realism about truth, are to some extent separate issues. I think in the end, obviously, any position has to speak to both. But I had not realized that, and I had not realized that one could, in principle, be what I called a scientific realist, meaning in the moral sciences, in my John Locke lectures. One could, in principle, be a scientific realist in that sense, except the no miracles argument, except what I call Boyd's principles. I'll remind you of those in a moment. But accept all that, and still, in principle, an anti-realist about truth. That's what I tried to do in the internal realist period. In the internal realist period, I did not give up what I called scientific realism in moral sciences. In fact, the beginning of the lecture, which was the manifesto of internal realism, the lecture titled Realism and Reason, the very beginning of that lecture, I affirmed the very principles I described as scientific realism and meaning in the moral sciences. Those principles are that the claims of a theory in mature science are typically approximately true, and the terms of a mature science typically refer. I still believe those principles, and I believe them. Scientific realism, in that sense, is a continuous element in thought. I still think that any account in which the laws of the modern physics, in modern mathematical physics, not Newton on, any account according to those are just useful constructs. They just happen to make all these successful predictions. It's insane. The idea that that we somehow made up the laws of nature, I want to say we're not smart enough to have made up the laws of nature, or even to have made up approximations to them of the kind we have today. Nature does surprise us. So in that I think I am absolutely convinced that we live in a world which is much bigger than us. Most of us would not make, and the truth about that world is not something we made. On the other hand, we do make conceptual schemes, but we do not make the world, not make what those schemes refer to.
An issue that was discussed today was about one quotation of yours and the view that, of course, is suggested there. It's about ethics. And ethics, that's from Ethics Without Ontology. Ethics doesn't presuppose something non-natural, something mysterious and sublime behind the goodness of standing invisibly I don't remember what
visibly behind our
behind the persons, the situations, etc. in question. So there is nothing like goodness out there. So some people in the audience have said, okay, but if you go against the idea that there are moral properties and that to which our moral statements correspond, why shouldn't do the same with scientific statements and the scientific properties to which they refer? So can you say more about it?
The important thing is, I don't deny that there are moral properties.
Yes, like
right? Yes, there is such a thing as bravery, courage. All the ones that Socrates talked about, bravery, courage, prudence, even goodness as a proper balance of all of these. The point of ethics, maybe the title Ethics Without Ontology was misleading. It would have been a longer title than Ethics Without Inflationary Ontology and Ethics Without Nothing But Ontology. The attack on that is not on ontology in the sense that it's all right, that I know the claim was no, there aren't any moral properties out there. The claim was they're neither quasi-supernatural in the way that remember G. Moore is my example of someone who inflates ethical properties. That is the idea of a simple, non-natural property of goodness. I think there is such a thing as goodness, and if a liberal naturalist needs to recognize that there are normative properties. But the problem is not to do without ontology, although I could do without Quine's intuition, without identifying ontology with something to do with quantifiers. I think that's useful for some purposes. For other purposes, it doesn't capture what the tradition meant by ontology. But let me just say one thing, maybe to steer the direction, a certain direction I have to steer. If one wants to ask what's new about the kind of realism I've been advocating, I would say if there's anything new about it, and I say claims of novelty are not that important to me in philosophy, but if there's anything new about it, it's the idea of entanglement. In a book that I Vivian Walsh titled The End of Value-Free Economics, we speak repeatedly of triple entanglement, the entanglement of fact, value, and convention. The idea that fact and values are entangled, it's not that was not recognized, it's that it was often regarded as an argument for anti-realism. The postmodernists did recognize that every factual claim is entangled with normative aspects, entangled with normative assumptions. They took that, especially Derrida, who I liked very much, by the way, Jack Derrida really saw the entanglement as proof this is just, that there's no objectivity here, that the term objectivity is an imperialist strategy. As on the contrary, if physics is objective, and if physics itself is deeply implicated in norms, because simplicity, coherence, elegance, we constantly judge theories in part by the conformity or lack of conformity with norms, not just with meter readings, not just with the way an experiment turned with a so-called observation set, as positivists taught. The positivists were constantly embarrassed by this. It is just a matter of comparing theory with data. You're constantly comparing theories with their fit or non-fit with norms. So that I would say the entanglement of norms and values, of norms and facts, is the point at which classical realism and classical anti-realism fail. They fail to see that realism about normativity and realism about facts need each other. While the third element, that there is an element of convention, but convention, again, doesn't mean we make up the stories. There, what I call conceptual relativity comes into play. The fact is, yes, the same fact, same states of affairs can sometimes be described in very different ways that, according to Aquinian, mean that the descriptions may have different ontologies in the rather technical sense he gave to the word ontology, and yet they may be just two different ways of describing the same states of affairs. So our choice, how we describe the state of affairs, involves facts, norms, conventions. And I was so I had to try to summarize the new realism, if you like. The metaphor would be a metaphor that the traditional fact-value dichotomy was like a stool on three legs, and all three legs are broken. There was a fact value dichotomy, there was a fact convention dichotomy, and so on.
Thank you. Now the Schulp's, the Library of Living Philosopher volume on Rorty is out. Yours will be out soon. And in the introduction to this book, that probably the last thing he wrote, Rorty said that in his career, he had always tried to couple philosophers of different traditions, saying that there were subtle affinities. And you are coupled with Derrida there. And Rorty said, but this couple never made the members of the couples happy. So, yes, a question about your relationship with postmodernism, both Rorty and Derrida, and what you think this philosophical experience has left us with.
I think I said in an old paper called Convention, a Theme in Philosophy, the term postmodernism was beginning to be used a lot. That was in the 80s, I think. And I said there that I regarded the use of the term, I don't think there is such a thing as postmodernism. In fact, everything that's supposedly shocking about postmodernism, you can find in Dadaism, in the radical wing, surrealism, the radical wing of modernism. I mean, if you can't just identify modernism with T.S. Eliot and say because we've broken with the fuddy-duddy modernism, and that was all there was to modernism. So we postmoderns have got beyond modernism. In fact, the word 1/10 as shocking as the radical wing of modernism. But let's see, coming back. But what I did say in Convention, a Theme in Philosophy was, there is no such thing as modernism. The use of the term is a symptom, and it's an interesting and important symptom. What it's a symptom of is we want to be after-modernist, but we don't know how. We're yearning for something, just as we're yearning for something after capitalism, but we don't know what it should be or how to get it. We're yearning for something after modernism. Let's be honest, we don't know what it would be or how to get it.
Okay, this big book is out then, A Philosophy in an Age of Science, and the title itself shows a problem that you have discussed in all your career. So the relationship between philosophy and science, and perhaps the right kind of naturalism we should look for. So could you say something about this?
Well, I'm grateful to you and to David MacArthur for introducing me to the term liberal naturalism, because once I read those two volumes that you edited, I realized that that's exactly the term that I needed. And I sort of swiped at least the liberal from it, and I referred to my position in philosophy of mind as liberal functionalism.
But why do you think liberal naturalism is different from standard scientific naturalism?
Because the part of naturalism, the part of standard naturalism, I noticed a long time ago in Boyd and Casper, I think, there's a definition of naturalism, which I criticized in the paper in the first of those, Naturalism in Question. In the paper for Naturalism in Question, I pointed out that the definition of naturalism, that what gives actually has the form of disjunction, which is a strange thing. Either the rejection of supernatural entities, and although I'm religious, I'm not a believer in the supernatural, but that's for another conference. But on the one hand, there was a definition that we could have accepted of naturalism, that is, doing philosophy without appeal to the supernatural, but perceiving the natural in a very wide sense, including that normativity is a part of nature as we know it. We are there such a thing. I think this is such a thing that maybe Ruth Milligan stressed as even earlier than I, the idea that there's room for the notion of the normal biological functioning, shades of Aristotle, but even in the age of Darwin, there's room for a notion of the normal biological functioning of a particular species, and that's not a reducible notion. It's not their friend, colleague, beloved Ernst Mayr stressed that the laws of evolutionary theory of biology, or not like laws of physics. He didn't even like to use the term law in biology because he thought that term has been preempted by physical science. Say there are laws in biology, people will at once think you're assimilating biology to physics. And he was absolutely right. I don't agree that we have to give up the term law, but we have to be very careful.
It's 5 o'clock.
So my computer is saying time it is, but it's still on television time, so it's not 5 o'clock.
Hilary, in this book, the new book, that the last thing you have written, I mean the last collection, there are 7 parts. One is, just to give you, to the audience, the idea of how rich your production is. The first part is called On the Relations Between
less
Philosophy...
than $10 a part. So the book costs less than $10 for each part. So
yes, that's true. It's big. It's 655 pages. So the first part is on the relations between philosophy and science, and there is some meta-philosophy and some philosophy of quantum mechanics. Then mathematics and logic, philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of logic, values and ethics, Wittgenstein, then the problems, pathos of skepticism, and then a section on experience and mind. Actually 6 parts, not 7 parts. Experience and mind. So 8 chapters, 7 chapters concern Wittgenstein. But there is one, the last one, Wittgenstein, a reprisal, that perhaps is the most innovative. What's your present view about Wittgenstein's philosophy?
Okay, my present view, there's a great deal, I think still think there's a great deal to be learned from Wittgenstein, but it's a mistake to treat him as either a god or a devil. And unfortunately, I have many dear friends, lifelong friends virtually in philosophy, who are Wittgensteinians. Cora Diamond and Jim Conan come immediately to mind. But in the end, I think they've made the mistake focusing making the meta-philosophy all important. They've fallen into a trap, I think, that was set forth by their antagonists, by Baker and Hacker. So almost too much as being, the whole question is, what did Wittgenstein mean by nonsense? And is the sense in which he thought metaphysics was nonsense when he wrote the Tractatus the same or not the same as the sense in which he thought metaphysics was nonsense in the middle period? And is that the same or not the same as the sense in which he thought metaphysics was nonsense in the investigations? And and last but not least, is uncertainty to be read in the same way? So you have now I think, let's just say that he was wrong all 4 times, however. Metaphysics is not nonsense. And in fact, it's interesting. Here, Wittgenstein is different from his close friends. I think when Wittgenstein said metaphysics is nonsense, he definitely included Plato. There's a tremendous, in fact, in Wittgenstein, a reappraisal. On the first page, there's a footnote in which I quote Wittgenstein as saying, basically, the Socratic dialogues are terrible. What's the point of all these arguments that clarify nothing and prove nothing? One of my friends in Israel, a very fine philosopher, Mark Steiner, said, yes, he has more. In the investigation, he praised Plato, something in one of Plato's dialogues. And I looked at it and said, yeah, what he praised was that Plato made the same mistake he made. He's very impressed by the fact that Plato made this mistake of believing in simples. Look, he anticipated something of mine. He doesn't say Plato said something right from which he learned. Plato was such a smart guy, he could even make the same mistakes as Wittgenstein. But look at Anscombe. I'm sure that was not her attitude towards Plato. And she loved Aquinas. I think Wittgenstein's own students and friends did not say that Plato is nonsense, or that Aristotle is nonsense, or that certainly not that Kant or Leibniz are nonsense. And maybe they would have thought, I know Gilbert Ryle thought that Hegel was nonsense, because I heard Gilbert say once that all philosophy was analytic philosophy until Hegel. and all the bad stuff comes from Hegel. Well, when I read Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Leibniz, Maimonides, and Hegel, I don't feel I'm reading nonsense. And if the only way they try to prove that philosophy is nonsense by claiming that to show, and with bad arguments, I think that Quine was nonsense. But even if that were right, how would that show that philosophy was nonsense? And I certainly don't think Quine was nonsense. So I want to say this whole idea that philosophy is nonsense was a mistake of Wittgenstein. It was it was in the air in the early 20th century. It's time to get beyond the early 20th century nonsense about philosophy being nonsense. But what you do, but there's a lot to be read. I taught a course, I just taught a semester on the later Wittgenstein, in which we did not discuss the arguments for and against the new Wittgenstein or for and against Baedeker and Hegel and Hacker. We discussed the rule-following argument, we discussed the private language argument, and we discussed the whole of uncertainty. And there's plenty there to discuss, and plenty there to agree with, and plenty there to disagree with.
Hilary, we are in Bonn here, invited by Professor Marcus Gabriel, who is a very young professor, but is very much into a new way of connecting European philosophy, American philosophy, and I think something new is rising here. But you are an example of someone in America, very influential philosopher, who was influenced by European and particularly German philosophers so much. I think the greatest influence on you came from two German philosophers. Am I wrong?
Well, who do you mean Reichenbach and Carnap, or do you mean?
Yes, Carnap and Reichenbach, right?
I think Reichenbach, certainly.
So what was your influence by these two great philosophers?
Well, Reichenbach, first of all, they were both extraordinary human beings. And they were both, I have to begin by paying a tribute to their moral and political courage. They were both men of the left, as I am, although in different ways. Reichenbach was a marked man in Germany, not because he was 1/4 Jewish. In time, that would have also caused him a lot of troubles, but because he was the head of the Young Socialists at the time of the German Revolution in 1918. He could never, when he survived, because when Hitler came to power, the Turkish government, which deserves eternal thanks for this, gave refuge to 50 German professors, Jews and non-Jews, who were in danger from the Nazis, on the condition that they teach in Istanbul for 5 years. And Reichenbach did learn Turkish, by the way. He lectured in Turkish. I've met former students. Years ago, I met students who studied with him in Istanbul. And so that this is a man of political and moral courage. Reichenbach, similarly, committed anti-Nazi, more sympathetic, I would say, to the Third International than the second. Is closer to communism, although again critical of Stalin, critical of anything interfered with democratic liberties. But they were both men of the far left and both willing to take risks for them. But in the long run, and Carnap, I think Carnap influenced mainly through his willingness to change his mind. And when I only had close contact with Carnap for 1 year. My first year at Princeton, he was at the Institute for Advanced Studies. I was on my first year of teaching at Princeton, and I went to see him every week. You know, it was a constant, long conversation. That 1 year of conversation with Carnap was wonderful, but I did not agree. Wanted me to work with him on his form of inductive logic. I ended up publishing a paper which argued that couldn't work, and which was the beginning of what's called trial and error learning theory as an alternative. But we were always had great respect for each other. And I met my wife, Ruth Anna, at a party in his honor, so which August 11th, 1960, August 27th, 1960. But Reichenbach, the influence in a sense much deeper than Carnap's. I mean, Carnap, I thought, look, according to Carnap, what's left to do in philosophy is rational reconstruction. And when you ask him, yes, what makes rational reconstruction right or wrong? He says, it's not right or wrong, it's a proposal to be judged pragmatically. I thought, what's the point of proposing new ways of speaking or thinking that nobody's going to use? when is, I mean, that the whole logical possibility to bind from the beginning. Reichenbach, remember, never did not, maybe very early before I knew it, already by the 38, Reichenbach rejected the term positivist. Reichenbach saw positivism as continuous with Mach, as holding that all science really does data, and he rejected the idea that science is really sensitive. And he proposed a way of doing science, of doing philosophy of science, which I think is much more productive. I think it is what the best philosophers of science do today, even if they don't. And I think many of them recognize that Carnap began that. It's much more perishable in a way than what Carnap did. If Carnap says all the problems of philosophy are going to be solved by symbolic logic, in one sense that was stillborn, and in another sense that could go on forever because it has no concrete content. Whereas Reichenbach said there is a task, and it's a task that the great philosophers, scientists like Leibniz and Kant were doing, which was to see what the metaphysical, he wouldn't have used the term metaphysical, but I would see what the metaphysical implications or the implications for philosophical problems are of the newer scientific theories. He was a friend of Einstein's. I had the privilege of meeting Einstein because they were friends, and I had a letter of introduction to Einstein from Reichenbach. But the idea, looking at science and asking, well, if our physical theories change, and our cosmology, our idea of the universe in the large, our idea of the universe in the small, our idea of what a good method is in science, our idea of the role of causality, as scientific theories change, there's a lot of work for philosophers to do in seeing what the philosophical implications of those changes are. Today, I think the philosopher who's, I don't know if he's read Reichenbach that much, the philosopher who's most doing what Reichenbach called for is Tim Maudlin at NYU, and whose books are marvelous in that respect, and exactly that.
One couple of more questions, and then we'll go with the questions from the audience. The first is, one issue that certainly proves the continuity between contemporary analytic philosophy, especially your own contemporary your own philosophy, and the classic tradition is the issue of skepticism, on which you have reflected for at least 40 years. So what is your present view of the relevance of the issue and the new ideas you have?
Well, I think it's connected. Obviously, realism and skepticism are connected. I mean, people sometimes say, well, it doesn't matter. Actual working science, whether you're a realist or not. Or there are people like emotivists in ethics who said, well, you may regard ethics as just expressions of approval and disapproval, but that doesn't have any implications for first order ethics. That you can still argue about whether capitalism is right or wrong or so on. Now, I think in one sense, in an important sense, that's misleading. It's true, logically speaking, one could hold a meta-philosophy according to which one's first-order beliefs are neither true nor false, or mere proposals or whatever. But in fact, I think both the history of science and the history of ethics shows that these various forms of skepticism, and I'll say in a moment why I call them skepticism, do impact how we conduct science, and they impact how we do ethics. I call them skepticism because there aren't, and maybe weren't even in ancient, it's a debate among classical philosophers whether there were skeptics who really tried to live their skepticism in Greece and Rome. But one thing is for sure, much positivism and much positivist influenced philosophy could be described as following strategy for resisting skepticism. Give the skeptic as much as you possibly can, as long as you don't have to throw away physics. And even physics that had effect. Look, we are now, discussion in physics constantly talk about entanglement, another use of entangle, but I'm happy with the coincidence. Discussions in physics constantly talk about quantum entanglement. Who discovered quantum entanglement? John Stuart Bell was the one and only leading mathematical physicist who took seriously that the so-called Copenhagen interpretation was nonsense, that it was physicists were talking nonsense in order to avoid asking, what does quantum mechanics imply about the nature of physical reality? It was precisely his willingness to take the reality question seriously in physics that led him to discover non-locality. And I think there are analogous ways, and you could say the postmoderns took skepticism about the objectivity of ethics to the point where it really begins to impact ethics itself.
Okay, Hilary, you told me that you have met great figure intellectuals, like when you were a child, you met Pirandello, then you met Einstein, you met Gödel, Chomsky, all the great intellectuals, and you met all the great philosophers of the last 40 or 50 years. So what you think of philosophy now? I know you think that there are two phases of philosophy, and can you tell us more about what you think of philosophy is and what it's for?
Well, I think philosophy, first of all, philosophy is, here again, I want to say Plato told you that already, but philosophy, first of all, is an attempt to, let's back off. My two favorite definitions of philosophy are Wilfrid Sellars and Stanley Cavell's. Sellars said that philosophy is concerned with how things, in the broadest sense of the term, hang together in the broadest sense of the term. That, I think, summarizes beautifully the metaphysical aspiration of philosophy, and the contempt for purely theoretical issues of that kind on the grounds, and I'm afraid that Wittgenstein at times talks that way, and so did the positivists, on the ground that, these discussions are interminable. They don't lead to a conclusion. Well, that's the voice of the 20th century capitalism speaking. That's the idea that, if it doesn't pay on the stock market, it doesn't pay. And I think it's precisely teaching people to think about the hard questions, even when there's uncertainty, and because there's uncertainty, and trying to put their own views, which will conflict, to make the best possible case for their own views, is tremendously important. If democracy is to not be reduced to marketing, then I think philosophy is an enormous role to play. And of course, it's not an accident that all humanities are under fire today. Independent, critical thinking that reminds us of that it ain't necessarily so. It's constantly necessary. And I think that's the test of philosophy, both and in science and meta-science.
Okay. First of all, let's thank Hilary for these answers.
Yeah, hi, nice to talk to you. I have two questions which came up in the conference. One is a question that I'm working on myself, so I'd love to get your answer to this question. And another question was heavily discussed after Mario's talk, where he was defending some of your most recent views. So the first question is, at some point in Ethics Without Ontology and in your earlier work, you say that there's a sense in which conceptual relativity can be interpreted as the claim that some aspect of existence amounts to a matter of convention. And you mentioned convention right now. Whereas I tend to believe that for some domains, that might be a very good description for spelling out how the existential quantifier is actually cashed out in the domain, whereas in other domains, that seems not to be the case. For example, I tend to believe that there is no mereological sum of the moon and the earth, and that is not mere matter, or because when I hear matter of convention, mere matter of convention. So I do think that it is in no relativizable sense the case that there is neither a mirth nor a un, where those would be the mereological sums of earth and moon. So I would like to hear how this fits into your concept of convention.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, the people who disagree with you disagree either because, yes, it is a fact and an important fact that there are mereological sums, or or like you, they're equally convinced that obviously there are no such things. And here, I guess, this sounds to me like a matter of convention, because when I actually, I'll say both, I'm more impressed in a sense by the argument for the reality of mereological sum, but for the moment I say my gut feeling is this, that when the actual that when you actually use mereological sums to talk about something non-metaphysical, of course, David Lewis has a very expanded notion of mereological sum, but the things he's putting in those sums are not scientific objects. They're not things whose existence science recognizes, this sort of atomless stuff, which maybe is not even in our possible world, but in other possible worlds. I mean, for David Lewis, mereological sums are part of a program of replacing set theory with something else. But what you use mereological sums, the way I think Carnap might use them, say, for example, it seems to me each sentence in the mereological sum language can, with a little effort, you can find a way of saying the same thing without mereological sums. So that would be if I were to say that there is a mereological sum consisting of the moon and the earth. Well, we all know that we could sum, even if we don't want to use sets, we do know that I do take it as controversial that the sum of two space-time regions is a space-time region. At least you can't do topology if you only allow convex space-time regions. And if you have non-convex space-time regions, then you say there is a region, every part of the moon is in it, and every part of the earth is in it, and nothing is in it which is not a part of the moon or part of the earth. Or that didn't quite work, but basically some of the regions which are non-controversial, or at least could function within. It seems to me that these, I would rather be a realist, if you like, in Quine's sense, or have in my ontology what Quine detested in the states of affairs.
Okay.
The same state of affairs is being described in two different languages. That's my preferred way of putting it. Now, just one more word. Recently, though, it occurred to me, with Jeff Hellman is working out in detail, and I'm also thinking about that, and corresponding about it, the ontological interpretation of mathematics. But as he does it in his book, Mathematics About Numbers, mereological sums play an essential role. So I might, in the end, find maybe there are good reasons. Maybe mereological sums will help one to develop mathematics in a non-Platonistic way, in which case I would have to rethink.
Yeah, thank you. And a brief second question on the entanglement of facts and values. How exactly to understand this? Because how does this relate to the principle of simplicity and the principle of coherence? Do you want to say that those principles are normative guides for science which are as much out there as the objects of science? Is that a sense in which the two are overcome? Or where exactly does the entanglement take place?
They're not out there. Take validity. I think the term valid in logic is in the same boat. And we don't. It's often said, well, we know what first order validity is by the Gödel completeness theorem. The problem is the Gödel completeness theorem. What the Gödel completeness theorem shows is that if you have something which is not provable in first order logic, then you can construct a model. In fact, I showed many years ago that you can construct a model in arithmetic which the predicates are simply truth functions of recursively enumerable predicates. You can construct a counter. Every formula of first order logic which is not provable is invalid in a sense which is very clear, namely the substitution in arithmetic which is false. But the other half, to say, but clearly those things that are provable are valid, relies on a notion of valid, which is at least just second order logic. And there's even the problem, yes, but then what validity in second order logic? So I would say, first of all, the problem here is big. I wouldn't say validity is out there because it's not any place. Out there, if It's not outside my skin because it's not in any place. But I do think there is such a thing as validity. And if you say, well, you have a deductive account, do you have an account of validity? I say, no. There's a lot. One reason in philosophy of perception, people constantly talk about the explanatory gap, the gap between the supposed gap between the objective scientific properties of things and the what it's like aspects. Yeah, the brain state just doesn't seem the sort of thing that could have a what it's like aspect. If there is an explanatory gap there, from minds and machines, I've not been convinced by that. What's really wrong is talking of the explanatory gap as if there's only one. There are an enormous number of explanatory gaps. I don't know how to account for printouts, I don't know how to account for reference in reductive terms. I don't know how to account for logical validity in reductive terms. But there are a lot of things I think are objective, but we're still primitive. Our physics has taken off. But, you know, now we ought to be in a position to at least sketch an answer to every philosophical question, I don't believe.
Yeah, okay, wonderful, thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, it's wonderful to see you. You must imagine that you speak to us in a godlike position, or at least as a kind of a prophet. You are a huge, there is a huge screen, and we're sitting there and admiring you. So I may ask my very humble question, and a simple one. If normativity is part of nature, where does the ought come from? It is such an important question for me because during this conference I learned so much, I'm a simple sociologist, so much about the refinement of speaking correctly about normative and factual realm of the world, of reality, of course. But where does it come from that we have a common feeling of what is undisputably sacred in a way that we do not want to discuss it? Is that a question?
I'm not sure. Well, I'm worried about this. This is, I have to reveal another of my side interests. I have once in my life directed a PhD thesis in Chinese philosophy. A student who wrote that dissertation is now a professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University, Galia Pachamir. And what strikes me is a question, central question for Chinese philosophy, and especially for Mencius. Mencius, of course, defended the naturalist view, that we don't need, that the Chinese way of putting the question is very interesting. True roots are one. Zwei Wurzeln. Does ethics have a supernatural root, a root in heaven in their terminology, and a root on earth, or simply an earthly root? And Mencius thought it simply has an earthly root. Now, obviously, that question is still with us. And I guess I'm torn by that question. I think there is such a thing as demandedness, and I don't have even an account of how it is that even a small child can understand the notion of an infinite series. And frankly, I don't. I certainly don't have a good answer to that. But I can do two things about it. First of all, I can see how a case can be made, at least a case can be made for purely naturalistness. I'm not sure that I'm wholly satisfied. Purely naturalist would be to say that human being, at least to say that it is a fact that human beings have certain needs. The needs, of course, are not entirely changed as culture changes. They're partly a historical product, but nonetheless, they are needs beings we have become. And I feel that justice, equality, respect for others are among those needs. I can see, But I feel even when he introduced the notion of an objective resolution of a problematic situation, I feel the need to say something more. And for him, that's right. And he doesn't, to his credit, tend to go beyond that, beyond the sense that there are objective resolutions to problematic situations. We have objective needs, it's undeniable. That I could only add one more thing, and this is something that comes to me from, again, thinking about Plato. And maybe it's my age, but I think myself thinking more and more about Plato. Plato does something, and of course Kant writes about too in a different spirit, but Plato does something which is very much neglected ethical thought. He connects the sense of beauty and the sense of God. The point like I take it of all the many dialogues is to see that selfish, greedy ways of living aren't just wrong, but ugly. He's trying to get the youth of Athens, especially young people who are going to be leaders, to see that the view represented by Thucydides is an ugly way of life. For me, that certainly is part of the demandedness of ethics, is a sense that I think there's something one fails to see if one doesn't see the ugliness, the beauty of life, or the ugliness of a way of life like Lysimachus.
Thank you very much. I was not able to seduce you to a religious commitment as a source of morality and normativity, but however, thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think there are other questions. Okay, Hilary, I think everyone here wants to thank you, and everyone wants to say how much we admire your work. Actually, this big part of this conference was inspired by your own philosophy. So in this sense, probably there is a continuity in the philosophy in the last 50 years. There is a lot of Putnamism there. So let's thank Hilary for everything. And
ja, und es tut mir leid, dass ich da nicht könnte da sein.
Bye.